In a hospital room, a man dies. Not metaphorically, not almost. He is gone, referred to as clinically dead. There is no heartbeat, there is no brain activity, there is no oxygen reaching his brain. For several minutes, he should experience exactly nothing. But when doctors finally manage to bring him back, he doesn't panic, he doesn't even ask what happened. Instead, he looks at the doctor and he says something chilling. I remember everything. And then he says something that makes the room go completely silent. He says, there was a scale and something was weighing me. Now, here is where we hit a snag, where we hit a problem, because this man has no knowledge of ancient Egypt, no interest in history, no exposure to mythology, and yet what he described next matches something that was written over 4,000 years ago. Now, welcome to my channel, to Science of the Unknown. If you haven't already, it would do me a great honor if you could hit that like and subscribe button before we get into it. At first, doctors assumed this was just another hallucination, a brain under stress, a dying mind trying to create meaning out of a fading world. But then more patients started saying the same thing. Not identical words, but the same structure, the same sequence, and they described the same feelings. When researchers started comparing these modern accounts to ancient texts, they found something deeply unsettling because the overlap wasn't vague, it was very specific, and it shouldn't exist. Thousands of years ago, ancient Egyptians created what might be the most detailed description of death ever recorded. It is known as the Book of the Dead, but this wasn't just mythology, it was treated as an instruction, a guide, a preparation, because to them, death was not the end. It was a transition. According to these texts, the moment that you die, you don't disappear, you merely separate. Your consciousness leaves your body and enters a place known as duet. And this is where things become structured because the duet isn't chaos, it is a path, a sequence, a journey you must move through, almost like a process. And what happens next is where things start to feel uncomfortably familiar. Across the world, people who have been clinically dead have been brought back, and they describe a pattern. Not chaos, not random dreams, but a sequence. They say that they leave their body, not metaphorically, but they watch it from above. Some even describe details in the room, such as conversations that took place, that they shouldn't have been able to hear or see. And then comes the movement. They begin to feel moved, pulled, guided, drawn forward, often through darkness, sometimes described as a tunnel. Step 3 is arrival, because then they encounter the light. Not just light, but presence, awareness, something that feels alive. And then the review. Everything changes because this is where people say that they experienced their whole life, their entire life all at once. Thousands of years ago, ancient Egyptians did something that no other civilization had done in this level of detail. They didn't just speculate about death, they mapped it in texts that we now refer to as the Book of the Dead. They recorded what believed happens step after step after you die. But here's what makes this different in mythology. This wasn't written as a story, it was written as instructions. These texts were buried with the dead, they were placed in tombs, they were wrapped with mummies, because the Egyptians believed something very specific. You would need this information. The Book of the Dead isn't just one fixed book. It is a collection of spells. Some of them are prayers, others are passwords, literal phrases you must say at specific moments to survive what comes next. According to these texts, after death, you don't just drift, you move through a series of gates, and at each gate, there are entities, beings that challenge you. And if you don't respond correctly, you do not pass. Now, pause for a second, because this is where things get uncomfortable. Modern NDE survivors sometimes describe being stopped, being questioned, feeling like they must prove something. Not always, but often enough that researchers have started noticing a pattern. Eventually, you arrive at a place known as the Hall of Judgment. Here, a god named Anubis leads you forward. In front of you is a scale. On one side is your heart, on the other is a feather. This is the feather of Amat, otherwise known as truth, balance, and order. But here's the detail most people don't know. You don't just stand there, you also speak. In the Book of the Dead, there is something called the negative confession. You must declare, I have not stolen. I have not caused suffering. I have not acted unjustly. Over and over, dozens of statements. Now, think about that, because modern NDE survivors don't recite those lines, but they describe something similar, a moment where their life is examined in terms of impact that they had on others. Not what they owned, not what they achieved, but how they treated others. If your heart fails the test, it isn't the punishment in the way we imagine. There's no fire, no torture. Instead, there is something waiting. A creature known as Amit, part lion, part crocodile, part hippo. If your heart is too heavy, it is devoured, and you cease to exist. No afterlife, no second chance. And this is where things start to feel less like mythology and more like a system. Because the Egyptians didn't describe chaos, they described a process, a sequence, a structure, exactly like modern near death experiences. Now, compare that to modern NDE survivors. What they describe is they don't see a literal scale, but they describe something eerily similar, a complete evaluation. They feel every action they took, every consequence from that action, every emotion they caused, not as memory, but as an experience. One person described it as, I didn't just see my life, I felt what I did to others. What is disturbing about modern NDEs and the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead is not that both have judgment, but how the judgment happens. In the Egyptian text, your heart isn't just a symbol. It represents your memories, your actions, your truth. And in modern NDEs, people don't just remember their life, they experience it from multiple perspectives. One person described it like this: it was like I became everyone I ever affected. Now, think about that, because that's not far from the idea of your heart holding the weight of your actions. Now, this idea stemming from the Book of the Dead is not just Egyptian. Scholars have pointed out that across African traditions, including Yoruba belief systems, there are consistent themes. movement between worlds, transitional states after death, moral or spiritual consequence. This suggests something important. Ancient Egypt may not be an isolated belief system, but part of a broader understanding that ancient cultures had of what happens to us when we die. Now, let's challenge this because we have to look at the explanations, and science does provide a few. For example, oxygen deprivation can create a tunnel vision, brain chemistry can generate intense hallucinations, and neural activity creates a narrative under stress. And these explanations matter because they prevent us from jumping to conclusions. But they don't explain everything. Even scientists have to admit that NDEs are often structured, consistent, and transformative. And perhaps the last part might be the most important. Because people who experience NDEs don't just come back with stories, they come back changed. They often lose the fear of death, become more empathetic, shift away from materialism, and report a sense of purpose. And here's the connection. Ancient Egyptians believed the same thing, that passing through death transforms you, revives you. Not everyone makes it through, but those that do become something else. So now we have a pattern. Thousands of years ago, a civilization describes a structured journey after death. Today, people briefly die and describe something strikingly similar. Different cultures, different eras, but the same structure. So we are left with two possibilities. The human brain, in its final moments, creates the same illusion over and over again for all of us. Or option two is that ancient humans were not imagining this, they were describing it. Because if near death experiences are real, even partially, then death isn't random. It's a process, a sequence, a transition. And if that's true, then the most unsettling question isn't what happens when we die? It is this: why does it feel like we already know? If you think that this is strange, it gets worse because there are cases where people describe things that they should never be able to. And we will cover that next.